The story of ancient Egypt has always felt like a giant locked box. A box that everyone can see but no one can fully open, and inside it are secrets that have been waiting for thousands of years, hidden under sand, buried inside massive temples, carved into walls, and whispered through strange symbols we still struggle to understand, and every time archaeologists think they have solved the puzzle, something new appears to make the mystery even deeper, and it all begins with the question, what did the people of ancient Egypt know that we do not? What secrets did they hide so carefully that even after thousands of years we are still searching for them? Because the pyramids themselves are like silent guards of those secrets, standing tall, heavy, and unshaken by time, as if they were made not just as tombs but as messages written in stone that only the future could try to read. And if you stand in front of the Great Pyramid of Giza at night, you feel like the stones are almost alive, watching you, telling you that something greater was once known, something powerful, something dangerous maybe, because Egypt was not just a kingdom of pharaohs, it was a civilization obsessed with eternity, obsessed with hiding knowledge that they believed must survive even when people and dynasties did not, and the evidence is everywhere. From the mysterious Book of the Dead that describes strange rituals for life after death, to the temples that align perfectly with the stars, to the underground tunnels filled with carvings of gods with animal heads and eyes that seem to follow you as if they are more than myths, as if they are memories of something real. And many historians believe that the true secrets of Egypt were never written in normal writing, they were hidden in codes, in architecture, in numbers, in shadows, and in ways that could not be erased even if the language was forgotten. Because while languages die, numbers and stars do not, and the Egyptians knew this very well. They looked at the sky not for beauty but for answers, for maps, for secrets about life and death. And one of the strangest mysteries is how the pyramids are aligned with Orion's belt in the night sky, as if they wanted to point future people to the stars, as if they were saying, look up, not down, because the truth is not buried in the sand but written above in the heavens. And yet at the same time, the pyramids hold dark chambers inside them, passages that go nowhere, sealed rooms that no one was meant to enter until the right time. And even now with modern technology, we keep finding hidden voids inside the Great Pyramid, huge empty spaces that no one can explain, like secret vaults waiting for something, maybe scrolls, maybe treasures, or maybe something else entirely, something too dangerous or too sacred for ordinary people to see. And this makes you wonder, what if the Egyptians had not gold, but knowledge that could change everything we know about history, science, even human existence, because they were builders of miracles without machines, movers of stones heavier than modern cranes can lift, and yet their writings speak not of how they built, but of gods who gave them power, of stars that guided them, and of rituals that kept their secrets locked. And in one strange papyrus found in the desert, there is talk of a hidden chamber beneath the paws of the Sphinx, a hall of records, where all the knowledge of Egypt and even civilizations before Egypt are stored. And while many say it is only a myth, ground scans under the Sphinx have shown mysterious cavities exactly where the texts describe, yet no one has been allowed to dig there fully, almost as if someone is stopping humanity from opening that last door. And maybe the Egyptians wanted it that way, maybe they wanted their greatest secret to remain hidden until the world was ready. But ready for what? No one can say, and this is what makes Egypt's secrets so terrifying and exciting at the same time, because what if those secrets are not about the past but about the future, warnings, instructions, or even keys to powers we cannot yet imagine, because time and again, Egyptian carvings show strange flying objects, giant glowing discs in the sky, beams of light, and beings that do not look fully human, and historians call them myths. But when you stand in the temples and look at those carvings, it does not feel like imagination, it feels like memory, like they saw something real and recorded it in the only way they knew, and even the mummification process itself feels like a secret science, a way to preserve the body not just for religious reasons but for some greater knowledge about life after death. Because why else would they go through such a difficult, precise process unless they knew something we don't? And when scientists study mummies today, they sometimes find things that should not exist. Chemicals that were not known at the time, strange traces. That suggests they had knowledge of medicine far ahead of their age, and still we are told it was all primitive. But deep down people feel it. Egypt was not primitive, it was extraordinary. And its secrets have survived because they were designed to, waiting for us, daring us to discover them. And this story, this journey, is about following those secrets, from the deserts where tombs lie unopened to the temples filled with riddles. From the whispers of curses that guard the dead to the mathematical perfection of monuments that touch the sky. Because the truth about Egypt is not only that it ruled for thousands of years, but that it planned for thousands more, leaving behind mysteries that still hold us today. And if you think this is only about stones and sand, then you are mistaken, because hidden within Egypt is the possibility that everything we know about human history is wrong. That a whole different story was carved into its walls, buried in its sands, and locked beneath its monuments. And the more you look, the more you realize that Egypt was not hiding from us, it was protecting something, and that something may be closer to being uncovered than ever before, for every discovery we make takes us one step closer to opening that ancient box. But are we ready for what is inside, or will the secrets of Egypt remain hidden for another 1,000 years, waiting, silent, eternal? Like the gaze of the Sphinx under the burning sun, watching, guarding, and keeping its ancient promise to protect the truth until the world is truly ready to hear it. And as the desert winds swept across the silent monuments, carrying grains of sand that had touched the stones for millennia, the feeling that Egypt was still alive, still breathing through its hidden chambers, became stronger. Because the deeper explorers and seekers have gone, the more they have found evidence that the ancients were not simply builders of stone but keepers of a sacred trust. A trust so old and so powerful that even time itself could not erase it. And when you think about the Great Sphinx, its face half eroded by storms yet still staring forward with that unblinking, eternal gaze, you begin to realize it is not just a statue but a sentinel, a guard posted at the threshold of something vast, perhaps the very Hall of Records, whispered about in forgotten papyri, and for centuries, whispers of explorers who dared dig beneath the Sphinx spoke of vibrations in the ground, hollow sounds that suggested vast chambers below. But every time investigations began, strange delays, restrictions, and mysterious orders stopped them, as if unseen hands wanted those secrets to stay buried. And the question grows, why would anyone want to keep us from knowing what lies beneath? Unless what is hidden there could challenge everything about our understanding of human history. And as researchers compared the alignments of temples with constellations, something astonishing appeared. Because not only are the pyramids aligned with Orion's belt, but ancient temples across Egypt seem to form a map, a network of stars translated into stone, as if the land itself was designed as a mirror of the heavens. And this suggests the builders were not simply worshippers of the stars but participants in a much greater design, a design that might have been taught to them by beings who had come from beyond the sky. And suddenly the stories carved in the walls of gods descending from the heavens on beams of light feel less like myths and more like encoded truths, and the deeper you study, the more strange coincidences appear. Because the mathematics of the Great Pyramid not only reflects the dimensions of Earth itself, its circumference, its relationship to the equator and poles, but also ratios connected to the speed of light, to celestial cycles, to hidden constants that humanity would not rediscover until modern science, raising the unsettling question. How did people more than 4,000 years ago know numbers that even today baffle scientists, unless their knowledge came from somewhere else? And this begins to unravel the idea that Egypt was only about kings and dynasties, because the monuments outlast the kings, the stories outlast the dynasties, the secrets remain untouched as though they were designed not for those times but for ours, waiting for the moment humanity would be advanced enough to decode them. And what if that moment is now? As modern technology scans through stone with muon detectors and finds voids hidden in the Great Pyramid, vast unexplored spaces that feel less like accidents and more like deliberate vaults, perhaps containing scrolls, artifacts, or machines that could rewrite everything. But even as the technology uncovers these anomalies, permission to explore them fully remains strangely withheld, and this makes you wonder, are we being protected from dangerous knowledge, or are powerful groups protecting the knowledge for themselves, keeping the rest of the world in the dark, just as the ancient priests once guarded their temples with curses and secrecy? Because the priests of Egypt were not simply religious leaders, they were scientists, astronomers, mathematicians, guardians of knowledge who decided what the pharaohs and the people would see, and what would remain hidden in mystery. And perhaps they hid more than rituals for the afterlife. Perhaps they hid truths about life itself, about the origins of humanity, about powers locked away so that only those who were worthy or ready could access them. And in one chilling legend inscribed in the Temple of Edfu, it is written that Egypt was once home to the primeval ones, beings who came before mankind, who taught humanity the arts of civilization, who guided the building of the first temples. But when disaster struck, when floods covered the world, their knowledge was hidden in secret shrines and halls beneath the sand, to be rediscovered in a future age. And now, with every stone we move, every chamber we scan, it feels like that prophecy is slowly being fulfilled, that Egypt's secrets are not only waiting but calling, and the more we search the louder that call becomes, echoing across the centuries, demanding to be uncovered, but with the warning that knowledge has a cost, and those who seek must be ready to face not just history but truth, a truth that may not be comforting but terrifying. For what if the secrets of Egypt tell us that we are not the first great civilization? That before us there were others, perhaps guided by beings from beyond, civilizations wiped out by forces we cannot yet imagine? And what if the warnings carved into stone are not only records of the past but prophecies for the future, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those who can read the stars as the ancients once did, to realize that the secrets of Egypt are not about worship, not about kings, but about survival, about preparing humanity for what is to come? And as the moon rises over the desert, casting silver light over the pyramids, you cannot help but feel that those secrets are closer than ever, waiting for the right moment, the right eyes, the right hearts to finally open the ancient box of truth that has been sealed for thousands of years, whispering still, through stone and shadow, daring us to take the next step, deeper into the labyrinth of time where Egypt's secrets remain, waiting, eternal, and unbroken. And as those carvings spoke of battles between light and darkness, between gods who walked like humans and humans who wanted to rise like gods, the archaeologists felt an unsettling presence, as though the very walls of the chamber remembered the weight of centuries and were whispering their memories through stone and silence. And deeper inside, a stairway was found descending below the tomb floor, hidden so well that even the shifting sands of time had not revealed it until this moment. And that stairway was not like the rest of the tomb. It was carved differently, with smoother stones, almost as if some technology unknown to the ancient world had cut them with precision that no simple tools could achieve. And as the team slowly moved down, their torches throwing long shadows against the walls, they realized they were entering a place that seemed untouched by air for thousands of years, a place where no dust had settled, as if something, or someone, had been keeping it preserved. And at the end of the staircase stood a massive stone door, sealed not with mud or plaster like typical Egyptian tombs but with what looked like a black, glassy material that absorbed the torchlight instead of reflecting it, making it appear like a void in the earth. And strange symbols glowed faintly on that black surface, not the kind of hieroglyphs the team had studied for years but something else entirely, symbols that seemed alive, as if burning softly under the skin of the stone. And as they touched it, a vibration passed through the ground like a heartbeat, sending fear through the hearts of everyone present. And then, with a sudden low groan, the door slid aside on its own, without any visible mechanism, revealing a chamber beyond so large and so perfectly shaped that it seemed impossible to have been built with the tools of its time, and in the middle of that chamber stood an object that froze them in their tracks. It was a massive cube of pure black stone, polished to a mirror-like finish, towering over them like a monument of another world, and yet, carved faintly on its surface, were figures of humans bowing to something above the sky, and in those carvings, above the heads of men, hovered shapes that did not resemble birds, stars, or any known deity. They resembled crafts, vehicles, things that could fly without wings, their outlines too precise to be dismissed as imagination. And the archaeologists realized with growing unease that they were staring at what looked like a memory carved into stone thousands of years ago, a memory of something not from this earth. And suddenly one of them noticed a narrow slit in the cube, a thin line that glowed faintly, as if waiting to be opened, but none dared touch it, for they felt that the cube was not dead stone but something alive, something aware, watching them as much as they were watching it, and in that silence. One of the inscriptions on the walls caught the light of the torch and revealed words that shook them. The ones who came from beyond gave us water, fire, and the secret of the hidden ocean, but they took our memory in return. And the archaeologists looked at each other, realizing they were standing in front of something that could rewrite all of history, something that connected ancient Egypt not just with its gods and pharaohs but with something far beyond Earth itself. And as they debated whether to document or to leave, the cube suddenly let out a faint hum, low and deep, like the sound of the earth itself breathing, and with every second, the humming grew louder, resonating in their bones, making their hands tremble, and they felt as if the very air was thick with an unseen force, and one of the torches flickered out on its own, plunging half the chamber into darkness, and then, from the slit in the cube, a narrow beam of blue light shot upward, striking the ceiling of the chamber, where a hidden dome of carvings revealed itself, showing stars, constellations, and a map of the sky not as it appeared today but as it must have looked thousands of years ago, as though whoever had built this place had knowledge of the heavens far greater than what human eyes could see at the time, and one of the constellations was marked with a symbol, a circle with 3 lines piercing through it, and beneath it was an image of a ship, not a boat that sailed the Nile but a craft that seemed to travel the heavens. And the realization sank into their hearts like ice. They were staring at directions, perhaps a map, to where these beings had come from, or where they had gone, and suddenly the humming stopped, the beam of light vanished, and the cube stood silent once more, as though it had shown them only a fragment of its truth, leaving them with more questions than answers, and fear. And beyond the silence of the black cube, the air felt heavier, as though the very atmosphere was resisting their presence, pressing against their chests with an invisible weight, and as the archaeologists stood frozen, listening to the fading echoes of the hum that had filled the chamber only moments before, they noticed something strange. The floor beneath the cube was not solid stone but layered with tiles that formed a pattern, a spiral of interlocking shapes that seemed to shift ever so slightly when seen from different angles, almost like an optical illusion carved into the ground, and when one of the team members stepped closer, brushing away the dust, they realized the spiral was pointing toward another passage hidden at the far end of the chamber, so dark that even the torchlight seemed to sink into it rather than illuminate it, as if the blackness itself was alive and swallowing the light whole. And with hesitant steps, they moved toward it, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the vast chamber, until they reached an archway carved with symbols far older than anything they had seen in the pyramids above, symbols so alien in design that they did not resemble writing at all but instead looked like flowing patterns, waves, and circles, as though someone had tried to capture the movement of water, wind, and stars in stone, and as they crossed the threshold, the ground beneath them trembled, dust falling from the ceiling like rain, and then the black cube behind them gave one last faint glow, pulsing once like a heartbeat before going completely dark, as though it had sealed them inside the next stage of the mystery. And the corridor ahead stretched endlessly, its walls so smooth they seemed unnatural, polished as if by machines, and faint lines of light glowed along the edges, guiding them deeper without the need for torches. Which made them uneasy because it meant this place was not only built thousands of years ago but somehow still alive, still powered, still waiting. And as they walked further, the walls began to change, covered now with carvings that depicted scenes unlike anything in Egyptian temples. The carvings showed humans kneeling in front of tall beings with elongated heads and luminous eyes, beings who held objects that looked like spheres of fire and rods of light, and the humans were shown receiving gifts, water flowing from nothing, fire igniting without wood, and what looked like seeds that grew instantly into tall plants. And the message was clear: these beings were not worshipped as gods in the usual sense but as givers of knowledge, bringers of power. And yet at the bottom of each carving, there were also scenes of punishment, of fire falling from the skies, of waters rising and drowning entire villages, of people running in terror, as if to remind anyone who entered that these gifts came at a cost. And with every step forward, the archaeologists felt a growing sense that they were not just walking into history but into a warning left behind, one that humanity had ignored or forgotten. And the corridor finally opened into another chamber, this one smaller, shaped like a perfect circle, and in the center stood something that none of them had ever seen in their lives: a sphere, perfectly smooth, floating several feet above the ground without any support, spinning slowly and radiating a faint golden glow. And as they circled around it, their reflections bent unnaturally across its surface, stretched and twisted, as if the sphere was bending not just light but reality itself. And when one of them dared to reach out a hand, the sphere pulsed brightly, filling the chamber with a sudden flash that revealed carvings across the circular walls. These carvings showed a timeline, stretching from the birth of Egypt to events that had not yet happened, cities that looked modern, towers of glass and steel, and disasters that had not yet occurred, floods, firestorms, and what looked like a shadow spreading across the earth. And as the sphere continued to glow, the archaeologists realized with a mixture of terror and awe that this was not just a relic of the past. It was a recorder, a memory, maybe even a machine, showing both history and the future. And its presence here suggested that Egypt's greatest secret was not about what had been but about what was still to come. And before they could even process the enormity of what they were seeing, the ground shook violently, a deep rumble echoing through the chamber, as though something vast was moving far beneath them, and cracks began to form along the edges of the walls, yet the sphere remained floating, untouched, spinning calmly as if it was indifferent to the chaos. And at that moment, the archaeologists understood that they had awakened something, or perhaps triggered a sequence that had been waiting for thousands of years. And as the rumble grew louder, they faced the dreadful question: had the ancients sealed this place to protect its knowledge, or to prevent it from ever being unleashed upon the world again? And as that dreadful question echoed in their minds, whether this hidden place had been built to protect humanity, or to shield the world from what was locked within, the rumbling beneath their feet grew louder, like the roar of a giant awakening deep under the desert. And the archaeologists clung to the smooth walls for balance as dust fell from the ceiling and thin cracks spread like veins of lightning across the polished stone. Yet the sphere in the center hovered calmly as though unaffected by the chaos, glowing with a steady rhythm, pulsing brighter with each tremor, almost as if it was feeding on the energy of the earth itself. And then suddenly the rumbling stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence so thick that their own breaths sounded deafening. And into that silence the golden sphere released a low hum, softer than before but sharper, like a key turning in a lock. And then the walls of the circular chamber shifted with a grinding sound, sliding apart to reveal hidden openings, leading into tunnels that spiraled outward like the spokes of a wheel, and each tunnel glowed faintly with a different color: blue, red, green, and silver, as though inviting the explorers to choose a path. And the team exchanged nervous glances because they knew that this choice was not random, that the builders of this place had designed it to test, to divide, or to guide those who dared to enter. And when the lead archaeologist stepped toward the blue tunnel, drawn by the strange cool light, The sphere pulsed again, brighter than before, casting their shadows long across the walls. And in that glow they noticed something chilling. The carvings had changed, or perhaps new images had revealed themselves, showing not just humans bowing to strange luminous beings but also humans chained, enslaved, carrying massive stones under the watchful gaze of figures that seemed both divine and terrifying. And the message was no longer of gifts and blessings but of dominance, of power used to control rather than to uplift. And suddenly the sphere flickered, projecting a vision into the air above it, a shimmering image that was not carved stone but living light. It showed a massive ship descending from the skies, a craft so large it blotted out the stars, its shape eerily similar to the carvings they had seen in the cube chamber, and beneath it the Nile Valley stretched out, filled with tiny figures looking up in awe and fear. And the ship released beams of light that struck the earth, creating fire where they landed, reshaping rivers, moving mountains, and the figures on the ground fell to their knees in submission. And then just as suddenly the vision shifted, showing a great city rising, tall pillars, shining temples, and pyramids glowing as though lit from within. And at the heart of it all stood humans crowned as kings, pharaohs, but their eyes glowed with the same light as the beings above. As if they were not fully human anymore, as if they carried the mark of something otherworldly. And then the vision shattered like glass, disappearing into sparks that faded back into the sphere, leaving the chamber dark and heavy once more, and the archaeologists staggered back in horror because they now understood the unspoken truth, that Egypt's rise, its sudden leap in knowledge, architecture, and power, may not have been the triumph of human genius alone but the result of a terrible bargain with forces not of this earth. And yet the deeper fear was not in the past but in the possibility that those forces had never truly left, that they were waiting, watching, and that this place, this secret buried under desert sands, was more than just a tomb of memory. It was a doorway, perhaps even a beacon, and as the silence thickened again, the faint sound of dripping water echoed from the blue tunnel, impossibly fresh and alive in a chamber sealed for millennia. And the leader of the team whispered in a trembling voice, "This is not just history we are uncovering, this is a warning." But before anyone could reply, the golden sphere pulsed violently, sending a wave of invisible force through the room that made the torches flicker out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. And in that suffocating blackness, the hum returned, deeper, stronger, like the heartbeat of something ancient stirring once more. And as their eyes adjusted to the faint glow still radiating from the sphere, they realized with growing dread that the entrances to the other tunnels were beginning to close, one by one, as though the chamber itself was forcing them to choose quickly before the chance was gone. And with shaking hands and pounding hearts, the archaeologists stepped forward, knowing that whichever path they chose, they were walking not just deeper into the earth but into the very secrets Egypt had guarded for thousands of years, secrets that could either save the future of mankind or destroy it forever. The desert night grew colder as the caravan pressed deeper into the Forbidden Valley, the very place where legends claimed that the priests of Ra had sealed away truths so powerful that even time itself had tried to bury them. And as the flickering torchlight danced against the broken cliffs, the group could feel that strange heaviness again, that unsettling vibration in the air that seemed neither natural nor earthly. As if invisible hands were pressing upon their chests, slowing their breath, testing their courage, and Dr. Aiden, though exhausted from the endless trek, could not stop replaying the carvings he had seen in the secret chamber beneath Dendera. Images that showed a serpent coiling around a sphere of light, a winged figure carrying scrolls wrapped in golden cloth, and most disturbing of all, the figure of a man not quite human, tall and thin with elongated skull, being worshipped by thousands of kneeling Egyptians, their faces marked with both reverence and fear. And, though his colleagues tried to brush it off as symbolic, Aiden felt something gnawing inside him, whispering that these were not mere myths but records of encounters lost to history, encounters with beings who walked among men long before pyramids stood tall in the desert. And as dawn crept slowly across the horizon, painting the sky with shades of crimson and gold, the group finally reached the hidden ruins that local Bedouins called the Mouth of Eternity, a jagged opening between two cliffs, carved with faded hieroglyphs so weathered that at first glance they looked like random scratches. Yet when Aiden brushed away the sand, he realized they told a story of a forgotten dynasty, one erased from all official king lists, a dynasty ruled not by pharaohs of flesh and blood but by the keepers of the sky flame. And before they could translate further, the ground trembled with a low, humming resonance, a sound too deep to be caused by wind, more like the echo of an ancient machine buried far below, and the Bedouin guide, terrified, begged them not to enter, warning that even his ancestors feared this cursed place, saying that those who entered never returned with their souls intact. But Aiden and his team, driven by hunger for truth, ignored his pleas and stepped inside, finding themselves in a tunnel so narrow and dark that only one torch could fit through at a time. The walls polished as if cut not by primitive tools but by precision unknown in that age, smooth like glass. And etched faintly into the stone were constellations, Orion, Sirius, and strange stars unknown to modern astronomy, glowing faintly as if infused with some kind of mineral that captured and released light. And as they walked further, the air thickened with a metallic tang, almost like ozone after a lightning storm, and the silence grew so heavy that even their footsteps seemed swallowed before echoing. Until suddenly the passage opened into a chamber unlike anything they had seen, a vast dome, supported by pillars carved into the shapes of beings half man, half animal, their eyes inlaid with what looked like black crystal, staring down like guardians of eternity. And in the center of the room was an enormous slab of stone, circular, covered in spirals and symbols none of them could fully comprehend, though Aiden felt a strange recognition, as if he had seen them before in dreams. And when his assistant placed the torch near the slab, the carvings began to shimmer faintly, lines of blue light racing through the grooves like veins awakening after centuries of slumber, filling the chamber with an otherworldly glow, and the team gasped in awe and terror as the symbols rearranged themselves before their eyes, shifting like living scripts, until they formed an image unmistakable, a massive ship descending from the heavens, beams of light connecting it to pyramids below, and surrounding it, priests kneeling in worship, holding scrolls that looked exactly like the mysterious papyrus they had once found sealed in a jar near Saqqara. And just as they tried to sketch the vision, the chamber shook violently, dust falling from the dome, and a hidden panel at the base of one pillar cracked open, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into pure darkness, from which a faint humming rose, steady and mechanical, and though fear gripped them all, Aiden felt compelled, as if something beyond himself was calling, pulling him closer to the truth, and so with trembling steps, they descended into the depths, the air growing colder, the walls narrowing again, until they reached a second chamber far below the earth, one that stunned them into silence, for it was no tomb, no temple, but something that looked terrifyingly advanced, a circular hall of stone fused with metal, its walls embedded with what seemed like crystalline panels that glowed faintly as if responding to their presence. And in the center stood an obelisk unlike any found above ground, black and polished to mirror like perfection, inscribed with unknown glyphs that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, and around its base lay hundreds of skeletal remains, some human, some disturbingly not, their elongated skulls and strange rib structures unlike any known species, as if guardians had died here to protect what lay within. And the team's historian whispered in horror that this chamber might predate Egypt itself, that it could belong to a civilization erased not by accident but by deliberate silence. And when Aiden pressed his hand against the black obelisk, the chamber roared to life, light flooding the panels, air vibrating with frequencies that made their teeth ache, and a projection emerged, three-dimensional, shimmering above the obelisk, showing not only Egypt but the entire planet, surrounded by lines of light crisscrossing like an ancient energy grid, converging at points where pyramids and megaliths stood. Giza, Stonehenge, Teotihuacan, Easter Island, and at the center of all lines glowed a single blazing star, Sirius, the dog star, long revered by Egyptians as the star of Isis, and the projection pulsed with a warning in an unknown tongue, yet somehow Aiden understood it in his mind, words not spoken but placed directly into his thoughts, telling of a covenant between the beings of the sky and the first rulers of Egypt, a pact to guard knowledge that could reshape worlds. Knowledge hidden beneath the sands until mankind was ready, and Aiden, overwhelmed by both terror and wonder, realized that this was the secret Egypt had hidden for thousands of years, a secret so vast it threatened to rewrite the story of civilization itself. But before he could record it, the ground shook again, harder, as if the very earth rebelled against the revelation, cracks spreading across the chamber floor, skeletal remains shattering as if animated by unseen forces. And from the walls came a sound like whispers, ancient voices rising in warning. "Leave! Or be bound as we were." And the team, paralyzed with fear, looked to Aiden, waiting for his decision. But even as the chamber threatened to collapse, he could not bring himself to turn away, for he knew they had only uncovered the surface of what lay hidden, and deeper still awaited the truth that time, kings, and even gods had tried to bury forever, a truth that still pulsed within the glowing obelisk, begging to be revealed in full. As if the very soul of Egypt had been waiting for this moment across millennia. And as the echoes of that wordless calling vibrated through the chamber, stronger than any sound yet deeper than silence, Aiden's pulse quickened because in that instant he realized the obelisk was not just a monument, but a living archive, a memory bank carved not of stone but of something far beyond earthly matter, a vessel of consciousness waiting patiently for minds willing, or foolish enough, to receive it. And as his hand lingered on the impossibly smooth surface, warmth spread through his arm like liquid fire, not burning but awakening, flooding him with images he could not control, visions of stars exploding, of vast ships traveling through corridors of light, of beings with radiant eyes standing before human ancestors and reshaping their bones, their minds, their very destiny. And within the visions he saw the rise of empires not recorded in any chronicle. Empires that stretched from one end of the planet to another, bound by the same grid of energy. The obelisk had just revealed a grid used to build, to heal, and to dominate, and yet he also saw rebellion, humans breaking free, resisting the keepers of the sky flame, shattering temples, hiding knowledge, swearing oaths to bury these truths so deep that only fragments would survive in myth. And as the torrent of visions surged faster, Aiden collapsed to his knees, gasping, clutching his chest as though his heart itself was being rewritten, while his team rushed toward him, terrified. Though none dared touch the obelisk for fear of suffering the same fate. But when Aiden raised his eyes again, they glowed faintly with a strange golden shimmer, and his voice, trembling, spoke words he did not understand, yet everyone heard with chilling clarity. "This place is not a tomb, it is a gate. And we were never meant to open it until the stars aligned once more." And at that exact moment the obelisk pulsed violently, casting a wave of light that swept through the chamber, illuminating hidden carvings along the walls that none had noticed before, carvings showing pharaohs bowing not to gods but to the obelisk itself, while above them ships hovered, raining streams of fire and water as if terraforming the land, and beneath those scenes, in smaller detail, were images that froze the blood of every archaeologist. Humans being judged, weighed against symbols of light and darkness, some ascending into brilliance while others were dragged into pits of shadow by elongated beings with skeletal faces, and the historian gasped, whispering that this was not just mythology but a cosmic judgment encoded into Egypt's hidden lore, a story older than dynasties, perhaps older than mankind itself. And as they argued in frantic whispers about whether to flee or continue, the ground split open near the base of the obelisk, revealing a staircase spiraling even deeper into blackness, exhaling a breath of air so cold and ancient it smelled of stone untouched for millions of years. And though logic screamed to escape, Aiden, still trembling, insisted they had no choice, that the obelisk had chosen. them that if they turned back now they would be forever hunted by the truth they had awakened, and as reluctant as they were, their curiosity, their hunger for knowledge, chained them to him. So together they descended, each step echoing like thunder, carrying them further into a labyrinth that seemed less built than grown, the walls shimmering with veins of metallic crystal, the air vibrating with an unearthly hum that resonated in their bones, and after what felt like hours they emerged into a colossal cavern so vast their torches could not find the ceiling, and there, stretching before them, was something none could have imagined, a fleet of enormous structures shaped like elongated pyramids yet inverted, suspended upside down as if gravity itself was bent, their surfaces covered in the same shifting glyphs as the obelisk, glowing faintly with a bluish light, and between them hung chains of energy, pulsing beams that connected each structure as though weaving a web, and the realization struck them all with paralyzing awe. This was not a burial chamber, not a temple, but a hangar. A resting place for vessels not of this world, ships that had been hidden beneath Egypt long before sand touched the desert, ships whose very presence could explain why the ancients built their monuments aligned to the stars, for they were imitating what lay hidden below, and as the team stood trembling, the ships hummed softly, as though sensing their presence, and the cavern itself came alive, the walls flickering with light that formed maps, timelines, warnings, and among them a recurring image, a great cycle. A wheel of stars turning again and again, and at its apex a symbol of fire descending toward Earth, and the historian's voice cracked as he translated the simplest word etched beside it. Return. And silence fell heavy as the implication sank in, that these ships, these beings, had not abandoned Earth at all, but merely slept, waiting for the appointed time to awaken, and now, perhaps through their intrusion, that time had been triggered, and as the realization coiled like ice around their hearts, the floor beneath their feet began to tremble again. But this was no collapse, it was the rhythm of engines long dormant beginning to stir, and the cavern filled with a rising hum that grew deeper, stronger, until it became indistinguishable from their own heartbeats, as though their bodies were being synchronized with the awakening machinery. And Aiden, his eyes glowing brighter, whispered with a voice no longer entirely his own, "The covenant is broken, the guardians return, and Egypt's secret will no longer sleep." And as those chilling words left Aiden's mouth, echoing across the cavern as though the walls themselves repeated them in voices older than stone, the air thickened with a weight that pressed upon every chest, as if unseen hands were testing their worthiness, and each member of the team felt their thoughts no longer entirely their own, as though their minds had been cracked open for inspection by something vast and ancient. Something that had slumbered through ages but was now stirring, stretching, reclaiming the dominion it once held, and the ships suspended above, inverted pyramids glowing with pulses of light, began to hum in unison, the beams of energy that bound them shifting from pale blue to a deep crimson, as though signaling a change, and with each shift the ground trembled with a rhythm too precise to be random, too deliberate to be natural. And it struck them like a truth carved into their bones that they were standing not in ruins but in the heart of a machine, a machine so colossal that Egypt itself was only the outer skin of its body. And when the historian stumbled backward, whispering in terror that these vessels were not sleeping tombs but living arks waiting for the return of their masters, Aiden's golden-lit eyes fixed upon her with a gaze both familiar and alien, his voice carrying that doubled resonance again, half human, half something older, declaring that they were witnessing the fulfillment of a cycle spoken of only in fragmented myths, the Zeb Tepi, the first time, when gods walked with men, a cycle destined to repeat once the stars realigned. And though his words made little sense to some, every one of them felt the weight of destiny closing in, the inevitability of their role as witnesses, perhaps even as participants, in an event no living human was meant to see. And as panic swelled in their hearts, one of the younger archaeologists broke, screaming that they had to leave, that this place was death itself, and he ran toward the spiral stair. But before his footsteps reached halfway, the beams of energy from the ships flared, and with a blinding flash he was frozen mid-stride, his body stiffening as though every cell had crystallized, until he shattered into dust, his scream cut short, leaving nothing but a fading echo and a pile of gray powder, and silence fell heavy as the surviving team stared in horror, realizing that escape was no longer an option, that the cavern itself would not allow departure, that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, and the Bedouin guide, trembling and whispering prayers, fell to his knees, declaring that the curse of the ancients had claimed them all. But Aiden stepped forward, his fear gone, his posture strangely calm, as though the presence inside him had consumed doubt, and he placed his hand upon a crystal vein running along the wall, causing it to flare with light. And suddenly the maps and symbols on the cavern walls shifted, no longer showing cycles and warnings but windows into other places, other times. The Nile Valley before it knew pyramids, lush and green under strange constellations, vast deserts turning fertile under beams of light descending from the sky, and then, more disturbingly, humans kneeling in endless lines, their faces upturned in worship as tall beings with elongated skulls placed strange crowns upon chosen rulers. Rulers who would later be remembered as divine kings, the pharaohs of legend, and the historian wept softly, understanding that every dynasty, every monument, every sacred ritual was not merely human invention but part of a pact older than history, a pact of servitude disguised as divinity. And she whispered through trembling lips that Egypt's greatness had been both gift and chain, that the wisdom of the stars was given not freely but in exchange for obedience. And the silence that followed was broken only by the deepening hum of the ships above, which now glowed brighter, their glyphs rippling with fluid light as though awakening memories buried in stone. And in that glow, Aiden spoke again, though it was unclear whether it was truly his voice or that of something using him, declaring that the Guardians would soon rise, that the covenant of millennia was ending, and mankind was about to face judgment once more. And though his colleagues tried to pull him away, shaking him, pleading with him to fight whatever force had taken root in his soul, his body stood firm, unyielding, as though fused to the crystal vein. And in that moment a roar unlike any earthly sound shook the cavern, a roar not heard with ears but felt within marrow, a vibration that carried words into their minds. The time has come. The sleepers awaken. The first time returns, and suddenly the cavern floor split apart along hidden seams, revealing not rock but mechanisms, gears of impossible scale that rotated and locked into new patterns, and from the depths rose columns of light, each one coiling upward like serpents, intertwining until they touched the suspended ships, charging them, feeding them, and the entire chamber brightened with a radiance that forced them to shield their eyes. But through the brilliance they saw shapes forming. Within the energy, silhouettes tall and thin, their skulls elongated, their limbs jointed strangely, stepping forth as though carved from the very light itself, and with every step they grew more solid, until they stood fully before the trembling humans, beings who looked exactly like the figures carved into the forbidden temple walls, the same skeletal faces worshipped in secret hieroglyphs, the same entities erased from official history, and the team fell to their knees, some from reverence, others from terror, for instinct screamed they were not in the presence of gods but of something that had once enslaved humanity, something that had returned to finish what it had begun. And one of the beings turned its gaze upon Aiden, tilting its head with a recognition that chilled the others to their core, and in that moment they understood. He was not merely an archaeologist who had stumbled upon forbidden truth. He had been chosen, perhaps long before birth, a vessel for the Covenant's return. And when he finally spoke again, his human voice gone entirely, he said only, "The judgment begins." And as those three words reverberated through the cavern, "The judgment begins," the entire chamber seemed to inhale, the very air pulling tight as though the earth itself was bracing for something immense. And the beings who had stepped forth from the light raised their elongated hands in unison, their fingers jointed strangely, bending at angles unfamiliar to human anatomy. And from the inverted ships above poured shafts of brilliance that bathed the archaeologists in alternating hues of red and silver, each beam striking them as though weighing, measuring, judging not only flesh but thought, soul, and memory. And in that unbearable light their minds were forced open to visions not of the present but of the distant past and an even more terrifying future, visions in which they saw humanity as clay, molded and remolded by hands not their own, civilizations rising and crumbling in cycles as the stars dictated. Kings crowned not by merit but by alignment to some cosmic pattern, and they saw the truth behind the myths of gods descending from the heavens, realizing with choking dread that these were not metaphors but historical records, veiled in allegory to hide the chains of servitude beneath the grandeur of divinity. And as the beams intensified, each archaeologist's fate became clear. Those whose hearts quivered with greed or fear felt the light turn searing hot, burning through their very essence until they cried out in agony, while others who carried within them unyielding wonder and reverence for truth found the light cool, like water washing over ancient wounds. And in that moment the historian, still kneeling, realized that the judgment was not of punishment alone but of selection, of choosing who would serve and who would be discarded, and she screamed for her companions to resist, to fight, to remember they were human and not pawns. But her words were drowned by the resonance of the ships, which grew louder, deeper, vibrating with such force that dust cascaded from unseen heights above and cracks splintered across the stone floor, revealing beneath it rivers of molten light that pulsed like veins through the planet itself. And in that glow Aidan raised his arms, his body no longer entirely flesh but suffused with golden energy, his veins illuminated like pathways of fire, and his voice boomed not with human lungs but with the echo of the cavern itself. From the first time we guided you, from the first time you faltered, and now the cycle closes. Those worthy will ascend, the rest will return to dust. And as his words fell, one of the beings moved forward, its height towering over any human, its hollow eyes glowing with a brilliance that pierced through bone, and it extended a long finger toward the historian, touching her forehead gently. And in that instant she was filled with floods of memory not her own, building of the first cities, rivers redirected with beams of light, voices teaching men to quarry stone with sound alone. Pyramids lifted not by slaves but by forces that bent gravity itself, and then darker memories of rebellion, of humans who tried to resist their so-called benefactors, their cries silenced by fire from the sky, their names erased from stone. And when the visions faded she collapsed to the ground sobbing, knowing now with absolute certainty that human history was a lie. That progress had never been mankind's triumph, but borrowed time granted by those who lurked above and beneath. And as she gasped for air she whispered, "We were never free." And the being before her tilted its head as though in pity before stepping back, and the others extended their hands again, channeling streams of light that now formed not just beams but symbols in the air, vast wheels of constellations spinning slowly, aligning with points above. And when those points clicked into perfect order the cavern quaked violently, the ships rumbling with a power not of this earth. And the archaeologists realized with terror that this place was not merely a hangar but a gate, that the inverted pyramids were engines meant to tear open the veil between earth and stars, to summon back whatever masters still lingered in the void. And Aidan, glowing like a living conduit, turned to his companions and for one fleeting moment his human voice broke through, crying, "Run, before they finish!" But even as he spoke the floor split wide, an abyss yawning where the molten veins of light poured upward like fountains, and from that abyss rose a sound so immense it seemed to drag their souls into its maw, a voice deeper than the planet itself declaring in a language none should have understood yet all could feel, "The door opens, and the forgotten return." And as the ground trembled and the ships above flared with energy enough to blot out sight, the team realized with shattering despair that Egypt's greatest secret was not that it had once been ruled by gods, but that those gods had never left at all. They had only been waiting, patient as stone, for the stars to realign. And now, with their awakening, mankind stood once more on the edge of change or extinction. And as the crushing weight of that realization bore down upon them, that mankind stood once more on the edge of chains or extinction, the cavern itself seemed to convulse as though alive. its walls shuddering and shedding fragments of crystal that dissolved into motes of light before reaching the floor, and the inverted ships, glowing like burning stars, rotated slowly in their suspended positions, their crimson beams now locking together in intricate patterns that formed a lattice across the chamber's sky, a net of energy too deliberate to be random, and within its shifting geometry swirled images of worlds beyond comprehension. Barren planets resculpted into gardens, seas boiled into deserts, entire species culled in waves of fire. And above all these images stood the same elongated figures, patient and unchanging, architects of both creation and ruin, and the surviving archaeologists, trembling, pressed close together like children clinging to one another in a storm, their hearts pounding in the knowledge that they were not simply witnesses to history but captives within it. And when the molten rivers beneath them surged higher, spraying sparks of liquid brilliance that did not burn but instead passed through flesh as though searching for resonance, each of them felt the probing touch of a judgment too vast to comprehend. A judgment that scoured not merely their lives but the inheritance of their blood, weighing the deeds of ancestors long turned to dust, as if no one ever truly escaped accountability. And the Bedouin guide, weeping openly, cried that this was the weighing of the heart, spoken of in ancient texts, the trial before Osiris, but twisted, stripped of ritual and symbolism, for this was the raw truth behind the myth. The gods had not weighed hearts from moral tales but as part of a system, a cosmic order where only the useful were preserved and the rest erased, and his words barely left his lips when one of the energy beams pierced him fully, his screams slicing the cavern before his body shattered into 1,000 motes of light that drifted upward into the lattice like fuel, leaving nothing but his sandals behind, and horror rooted the survivors in place. Yet even in that terror the historian's eyes widened, because in that instant she understood the true function of the obelisk above ground, of the pyramids aligned with Orion, of the endless rituals carved into temple walls. They had not been monuments of worship but markers of timing, mechanisms in a planetary clock designed to awaken this gate when the stars returned to their proper alignment. And her voice cracked as she tried to speak. "This isn't the end, it's the reset." But her words were drowned by the rising hum of the ships, now thunderous, now alive, now engines of something vaster than Earth, and within the abyss below, shapes began to stir, colossal silhouettes moving in the molten light as though climbing upward from a depth far greater than stone, and the beings who had stepped from the light turned their skeletal faces toward Aiden, bowing slightly as if to acknowledge his role, and Aiden, if Aiden still remained within that radiant vessel of flesh, spread his arms wide, his golden-lit veins pulsing faster, his voice layered with unearthly tones as he declared, "The gate is open. The first time returns. Those who serve will ascend. Those who resist will perish." And as those words thundered from Aiden's transfigured form, "The gate is open. The first time returns. Those who serve will ascend. Those who resist will perish." The sound did not fade like ordinary speech but seemed to weave itself into the very stones of the cavern, echoing in endless layers, as though the walls themselves were speaking in tandem, and the earth above, deserts and ruins alike, trembled faintly under the weight of something awakening beneath, while within the cavern the inverted ships reached their final alignment, their lattices of crimson and silver light locking into a geometry so perfect it made the human eye ache to look upon, as though they had become both map and machine, key and doorway. And as the net of light pulsed, symbols older than hieroglyphs spiraled across it, glyphs of serpents swallowing stars, suns eclipsed by wings, men kneeling before figures of impossible height, and as each symbol completed itself it sank into the archaeologists' minds, forcing them to see truths they had never asked to bear. Visions of Nile kings bowing not to gods but to masters from the sky, of the pyramids glowing like beacons, each stone vibrating like a note in a vast symphony, sending signals outward into the stars, of ancient priests cutting open the chests of chosen servants to release what they called Ka, not as ritual but as fuel for the ships suspended in the heavens, and even further back, before the deserts were deserts, before even the Nile carved its way into the earth, they saw humans as experiments, their spines adjusted, their skulls reshaped, their languages guided by tones that were not their own, and horror twisted through every survivor's heart as the molten rivers below surged again, their brightness so intense that the cavern floor seemed to hover over an ocean of living fire, and from that ocean shapes began to rise more clearly, colossal figures with bodies half-formed, skeletal and yet armored, their heads elongated like those of the beings above but far more immense, and their limbs ending in structures not meant for flesh but for manipulation of forces unseen, and as their silhouettes dragged themselves upward the very air thickened, as though time itself grew heavy, the ticks of existence stretched and slowed, and in that unbearable pressure the historian found herself gasping not only for breath but for thought, as if her very consciousness was being squeezed, tested, pulled apart, and in her mind she heard whispers in 1,000 tongues, all carrying the same meaning: the cycle closes. The balance is weighed, the servants are chosen. And she realized with terror that this was the mechanism behind the myths of judgment in the afterlife, the weighing of the heart against the feather of Maat. It had never been metaphorical, it had been a memory, a distorted echo of something her ancestors had endured when these beings last walked among them. And now it was happening again, not in temples of stone but in the very living chamber of the earth. And as her lips tried to form a prayer, she saw one of her companions, the youngest, a student barely older than 20, collapse under the beams of light, his body convulsing as though every atom in him was being rewritten, and with a strangled cry he rose again, his eyes vacant, his voice no longer his but a harmonic vibration as he stepped toward Aiden and knelt, transformed from human to vessel, his will erased, his soul reforged, and the beings nodded approvingly, their skeletal faces expressionless yet exuding an air of satisfaction, and Aiden, now more radiant than before, gestured toward the abyss as though inviting the others to choose, and one of the older archaeologists, trembling with rage rather than submission, shouted defiantly that humanity would never kneel again, that this planet belonged to its people, not to parasites disguised as gods, and he hurled a stone toward the nearest being, a useless gesture but the last shred of human rebellion in that place, and the stone dissolved mid-air, turning to dust before it touched the creature, and in the same instant the archaeologist himself convulsed, his body folding in on itself until nothing but a smear of black ash remained where he had stood, and the others recoiled, horror-stricken, but beneath their terror was also despair, for the cavern had shown them already. Resistance meant annihilation, submission meant survival, and yet what kind of survival was it to serve as pawns, as vessels, as slaves in cycles older than memory? And the historian's mind raced, her training in ancient texts colliding with the visions forced into her by the beams of light, and she realized there might yet be something hidden, some fragment of the covenant forgotten even by these beings, for in the Book of the Dead, in the pyramid texts, in the scattered glyphs of forbidden chambers, there were hints of a second path, a way not of submission but of concealment, of escaping the cycle by becoming invisible to the gods themselves, and though her body trembled she pressed her palms into the crystal veined wall beside her, praying silently that it might reveal the secret as it had revealed the past, and to her astonishment the veins responded, flaring with a pale blue glow instead of the crimson and silver of the being's beams, a softer light, colder, older, and within it she saw shapes of jackals and stars, Anubis guiding souls not to servitude but to the hidden roads of the Duat, the underworld. And she realized with a start that the myths had never told the full truth. Osiris had ruled judgment for the chosen, but Anubis had guarded another way, a forbidden way, one that allowed escape into shadows where even the gods could not see, and with desperation she whispered this to the others, urging them to turn from the light, to resist not by defiance but by concealment. But few listened, for the brilliance of the ships and the pressure of the being's gaze was overwhelming, pressing their wills into submission. And more of her companions fell to their knees, surrendering, their eyes glazing as they were remade into empty vessels, and only a handful remained standing, torn between the agony of resistance and the horror of submission. And as the colossal shapes from the abyss pulled themselves higher, their forms now revealed as titans of bone and light, taller than the pyramids themselves, Aiden raised his hands toward them, his voice merging with theirs in a chant that shook the cavern. The first time returns, the covenant renews, the children of dust shall kneel. And it was then that the historian realized the true horror, that Aiden was not merely a vessel but the linchpin, the bridge, the anchor by which these beings could pass fully into the world of flesh, and that if his bond were broken, perhaps the gate would collapse, perhaps the cycle could be delayed, if not destroyed. And with that desperate thought blazing in her mind, she tore herself from the wall and stumbled forward, her body weak, her throat raw, and screamed his name, not the voice of the gods, not the chant of the covenant, but his human name, the one tied to laughter, to life, to the person he once was. Aiden! And for a flicker, for the briefest instant, the golden light in his veins faltered, his human eyes glimmered through the radiance, and his lips parted as though to answer. But the beings surrounding him hissed, a sound like wind through tombs, and their beams struck her full force, searing into her chest, lifting her from the ground. Yet even as her vision blurred with agony, she screamed again, pouring all her will, all her memory of humanity into his name. Aiden! And in that final echo, something shifted, the lattice of light above quivering as though destabilized, the colossal shapes below pausing mid-ascent, their skeletal faces turning not with triumph but with uncertainty. And in that hesitation, in that fracture, lay the slimmest chance of escape, the thinnest thread of hope, though the chamber still thundered with power and the judgment of gods was far from finished. And though the chamber still thundered with power and the judgment of gods was far from finished, that single fracture, that hesitation birthed by the historian's desperate cry, spread like a crack through glass, subtle yet unstoppable, and in the trembling geometry of the light lattice above, once perfect lines wavered, their angles trembling as if the very mathematics of the gods could falter under the weight of human memory. And in that split second the colossal titans dragging themselves from the abyss halted mid-ascent, their bone-and-light forms turning their elongated skulls toward Aiden, no longer with silent approval but with suspicion, for the bond that tethered him to their power pulsed unevenly now, golden veins flickering between brilliance and shadow, and within his face the mask of radiant vessel warred with the flicker of a mortal boy who once laughed under desert skies. And the archaeologists who had not yet surrendered felt that tremor, that faint opening, and clung to it as drowning men cling to driftwood, their hearts pounding with the possibility that the cycle, though vast and ancient, was not invulnerable, that cracks existed even in the walls of eternity, and the historian, though suspended in the searing beams of alien judgment, her body half consumed by the light, felt her consciousness stretched across two planes, one anchored in her breaking flesh, the other pulled into a vast corridor of shadow where the pale blue glow of Anubis rode, awaited, and there, in the liminal darkness between annihilation and concealment, she heard a voice not of thunder but of whisper, not commanding but guiding, a jackal's murmur. There is always a hidden door, but it must be chosen, not given, and her eyes, though blinded by light, turned inward, and she saw the faint outline of a glyph in her memory, one she had studied years ago but never understood. Carved into the forbidden walls of Saqqara, two crossed feathers beneath a veiled star, a symbol erased from official records by priests who had declared it heresy, and now she realized why. It had been a map to the second path, a road that could sever sight, a veil even gods could not pierce, and clutching that revelation like a weapon, she forced herself to scream again, though blood filled her throat, not only Aiden's name but the forgotten word, the word buried in her research, the name erased from scrolls. Septu! And the cavern convulsed as if the name itself were poison, the lattice above spasming, lines shattering into sparks before repairing themselves, and the titans below roared in fury, their soundless voices vibrating directly into bone, for they recognized the word, and feared it, for it was the name of the hidden current that once allowed mortals to vanish beyond their reach. And Aidan, hearing it, shuddered violently, his body arching, torn between two truths, and in his eyes now the human glimmer grew brighter, his lips trembling as though trying to form not the god's chant but his own words, his own will, and the beings encircling him hissed louder, their beams intensifying, striking the historian harder, burning her to ash from the inside out. But before she could dissolve, before her final cry was extinguished, she felt hands seize her wrists, not human hands but shadows shaped like hands, pulling her sideways into the corridor of Anubis, tearing her from the beam just as her body began to collapse, and with a scream that tore into silence she vanished from the chamber, leaving only a wisp of pale blue smoke behind. And in her absence the beings faltered, for she had not been consumed, not erased, but taken, stolen from their judgment, and their control wavered, and Aidan fell to his knees, clutching his head, his voice a broken stammer between the chant of gods and the whisper of his human self. And the few archaeologists left alive seized the moment, some screaming prayers, others hurling themselves against the crystal walls in mad desperation, and though none could break free of the cavern's hold, the air itself shifted, the inevitability of domination suddenly laced with doubt, and in that doubt, in that trembling pause, history bent, the cycle quivered, and for the first time in thousands of years, the outcome was no longer certain. And in that doubt, in that trembling pause, history bent, the cycle quivered, and for the first time in thousands of years, the outcome was no longer certain, for the cavern which had been a place of unshakable geometry, a theater of inevitability, now bore the faint hairline fractures of unpredictability, and while Aidan knelt trembling, torn between the divine lattice pulsing through his veins and the fragile memory of a human self, the Titans halted in their climb, their skeletal bodies hovering half-born from the abyss like stalled nightmares, their eyeless faces tilting with unreadable scrutiny, and above, the inverted ships hummed with agitation, their crystalline beams no longer a perfect harmony but a discordant, quivering song, as though reality itself recoiled from the forbidden word the historian had spoken, and in that moment the archaeologists left behind the remnants of what had once been a team of scholars, felt the suffocating inevitability of doom loosen its chokehold just enough for thought, for will, for a dangerous hope, and though most were too paralyzed by terror to act, one among them, a grizzled Egyptologist who had spent his life chasing half-buried truths in tombs dismissed as fables, raised his trembling eyes toward the fractured lattice and remembered the countless inscriptions he had once seen on broken limestone fragments in forgotten mastabas, not the songs of Osiris, not the hymns to Ra, but prayers to shadows, invocations not of triumph but of hiding, and though his lips bled from where he had bitten them in despair, he began to whisper those words, his voice small against the roar of titans and ships, yet carrying into the cracks like sand filling stone. And in another plane, far from the cavern yet tethered still, the historian stumbled along the shadowed corridor of Anubis, her body no longer flesh but a vessel of half-formed light. Her senses stretched beyond human measure, and she saw that the corridor was not a straight road but a labyrinth of interwoven paths, each lined with carvings not etched by human hand but by something deeper, symbols that shifted as she gazed at them, showing one moment jackals, then stars, then rivers of dark water, then the skeletal faces of beings so ancient that even gods might have forgotten their names, and the murmur of Anubis grew stronger, not a single voice but a chorus of whispers, telling her that the second path was not one way but many, each requiring choice, each demanding sacrifice, and behind her she could still feel the pull of the cavern, the tether of her companion's fear and Aidan's fractured soul, and though she wanted to collapse, to rest in the silence of the corridor, she forced herself onward, because the whispers carried urgency. The door is open, the cycle turns, if you do not close it, they will walk the earth again. And as she staggered, she glimpsed images unfurling along the corridor's walls, like a chronicle older than history. She saw the first time, when the Titans had fully risen, their forms striding across the Nile Valley before it was a desert, their ships blotting the sky like black suns, humans kneeling in endless rows, their bodies reshaped into servants, their languages burned from their tongues, their cities built not for themselves but as resonant engines to amplify the Titans' will. And she realized with horror that Egypt's glory, its golden age of pyramids and temples, had been a prison dressed as civilization, a symphony of stone to keep the cycle alive. And though millennia had passed, though sands had buried the truth, the Titans had only slept, waiting for the gate to reopen. And now through Aden, through the lattice, they were awakening again. And she fell to her knees, clutching her head as the weight of this revelation seared her. Yet in the midst of that crushing despair she also saw something else, a fragment, a defiance. Not all humans had knelt, not all had submitted, for in the hidden corners of the Nile, beneath forgotten cliffs and drowned caves, there had been those who fled into the second path, guided by jackals, vanishing from the eyes of gods, carrying with them seeds of resistance, seeds that had blossomed over ages as fragments of myth, whispers of forbidden names. And she realized that her cry of Septu had not been random but the echo of those ancient rebels, preserved in silence, waiting for a moment exactly like this, and that knowledge steeled her. Even as the corridor split before her into three shadowed ways, one lined with glowing eyes, one dripping with black water, one burning with pale fire, each thrumming with a different fate, and she knew she had no time, for in the cavern Aden screamed, a sound that split across plains, his human voice and god voice clashing violently, and the Titans howled in response, their massive claws gripping the edges of the abyss as though to tear themselves upward, and the archaeologists cowered as shards of crystal fell from the ceiling like rain of knives, and the grizzled Egyptologist who had whispered to shadows suddenly convulsed, his body glowing with a pale blue shimmer not of submission but of concealment, his outline blurring as though slipping from reality, and the beings turned on him with rage, their beams lashing out, but they struck only emptiness. For he had stepped onto the second path without vanishing from the cavern entirely, half here, half there, a defiance that proved the cycle was not perfect, and his hollow laughter echoed as he disappeared fully into shadow, inspiring the others with both awe and terror, for if one of them could escape, then perhaps more could follow, though the risk was annihilation, and Aden, witnessing it, clutched his skull and shouted a word not given by the gods but dredged from his memory, his sister's name, long dead, spoken in grief, and that human sound made the lattice above shriek, entire segments of its perfect geometry shattering into sparks that rained down into the abyss, searing the Titans' forms, and for the first time the gods recoiled, their skeletal faces twisting in fury, their beams flaring erratically. And in the corridor the historian saw this too, for the walls of Anubis' path were not walls but mirrors of events, showing her the cavern's chaos. And she realized with pounding dread that this was her chance, that Aden's human memory, combined with the forbidden name she had spoken, had destabilized the gate. And that if she could find the true glyph of concealment, the sigil of vanishing, she might sever the Titan's tether entirely, collapsing the gate before they could ascend. But to do so she would need to choose the correct path, and the whispers of Anubis grew more urgent, urging her forward, telling her that the choice would cost her more than her life, that she would never again see the world as flesh, that her soul itself would be bound to the shadow forever. But if she failed, the earth would be remade as it had been in the first time, a world of endless submission beneath skeletal rulers of bone and fire. And though terror clawed at her, though her body, if it could still be called a body, shook, she forced herself to rise and step toward the path of pale fire, for in its glow she saw not gods but humans, silhouettes of those who had once defied, carrying torches of flame that burned against the endless night. And as she stepped, the corridor swallowed her, the whispers merging into silence. And in the cavern at that same instant the inverted ships screeched as, though pierced, the Titans bellowed in fury, and Aden collapsed flat against the stone, torn between vessel and man, between slavery and freedom, and the surviving archaeologists cried out, their voices ragged with both despair and hope, for they knew that something unseen, something older than gods, was now moving in the shadows, and whatever its choice, the fate of humanity would be rewritten in fire or in darkness. And whatever its choice, the fate of humanity would be rewritten in fire or in darkness, for as the historian stepped deeper into the corridor of pale fire, her body dissolved further into something neither shadow nor light, her heartbeat fading yet her awareness magnified until she could feel the pulse of the stone beneath her, hear the whispers of long-dead tongues vibrating faintly in the air, and see before her an endless expanse where flames flicker not to consume but to illuminate. And in those flames were figures, men, women, even children, shadows of humanities. Forgotten rebels, their faces determined, their eyes filled with defiance, as they held torches against an abyss that stretched beyond sight. And when she moved closer she realized these were not merely ghosts but memories made flesh, fragments of the humans who had once chosen the second path, lingering as guardians of the flame, and they turned their gaze upon her as if weighing her worth, for though she carried the word Septu, and had glimpsed the glyph of vanishing, she was still mortal, still fragile, still prone to fear, and one step forward, a woman with eyes like obsidian and a crown of braided reeds, who spoke in a language the historian somehow understood, not with ears but with the marrow of her bones, saying, "The fire is not to burn the gods, for flame cannot wound them. The fire is to burn memory, to sever the chains they laid upon the world." And as she spoke the flames flared higher, revealing that each torch was not wood but a scroll, each inscribed with a name, a word, a fragment of history, and the historian's chest tightened with realization. The torches were memories, truths carried into the shadows so that they could not be erased, and now they burned here eternally, waiting to be wielded, and she knew that if she could claim one, she might strike not at the Titans' bodies but at their very memory of dominion, unraveling their tether by erasing their hold upon human history itself. Yet the woman warned her that such a choice came at a cost, for to carry one torch meant surrendering all other memories. Her life, her name, her face would be consumed, leaving her only as a vessel of the flame she chose, and the historian trembled, for she thought of her companion still trapped in the cavern, of Aidan writhing between man and vessel, of the archaeologists clinging to shards of hope, and of the world above, ignorant of how close it was to being drowned again in a cycle older than time. And though her fear urged her to flee, her resolve hardened, and she stepped toward the torches, reaching her hand toward one inscribed with the glyph she had studied years ago, the veiled star above the crossed feathers, the forbidden symbol of concealment. But as her fingers brushed it, the entire corridor convulsed, and she was struck with visions of the cavern, where chaos escalated beyond comprehension, for Aidan had risen again, his body torn between glowing divinity and bleeding humanity, his voice alternating between the hollow chants of the gods and the broken cries of a man calling for his sister, and the lattice above cracked further, great shards tumbling down into the abyss, splintering against the Titans' limbs, searing them with fire that should not have existed in their realm, and the Titans howled, their voices rattling bones, their skeletal hands clutching the edges of the pit as though to drag themselves free, and the inverted ships wailed, their crystalline beams swinging wildly, no longer symmetrical, no longer flawless, their light flashing across the chamber in dissonant bursts that seared walls and flesh alike, and the surviving archaeologists screamed, some falling to their knees in prayer, others clawing at the walls in madness, while one young scholar, driven past fear into reckless desperation, seized a fragment of falling crystal and plunged it into the glowing floor, and to everyone's shock the floor bled light, rippling outward as though the cavern itself were alive, and the Titans recoiled at that wound as though it were their own flesh, and in that moment Aidan collapsed again, his body convulsing, golden veins of godlight flickering between brilliance and darkness, and he cried out, not in the god's tongue but in his own voice, "Help me!" A cry so raw, so human, that it pierced even the historian's corridor, echoing in her soul like a blade, and the guardians of pale fire turned their heads toward her as though to say, "The time is now, choose," and her trembling hand closed fully around the torch inscribed with the veiled star, and instantly fire seared her, burning through every vein, erasing her name, her face, her entire life in a torrent of pain so profound it felt eternal, and when it subsided she realized she no longer remembered who she had been. Only the word, only the glyph, only the flame of concealment burned within her, and she stumbled forward, her torch blazing with fire not of heat but of memory undone, and the corridor split again, showing her a rift, a doorway leading directly back into the cavern, and she knew this was the moment of return, the moment when the second path would bleed into the first, and she stepped through, torch raised. As the cavern erupted in fury, and when the Titans saw her emerge, her body now a silhouette of fire against the shadows, they screamed in unison, for they recognized the weapon she carried, and they hurled their beams upon her, lashing her with light meant to erase. But the torch devoured it, burning the beams into nothingness, and the inverted ships above faltered, their beams sputtering, their geometry collapsing further, and Aiden's eyes widened as he saw her. And for a moment his human side surged, golden light retreating from his veins, his face softening as though he remembered everything he was, and the archaeologist gasped, some weeping, some screaming, for in the historian they no longer saw a woman but a vessel of defiance, and the cavern shook so violently that cracks split the walls, dust and shards of crystal raining down like hail, and above, far above in the desert sands, the ground trembled, pyramids groaned, the Nile quivered as though pulled by unseeing tides, and across the world subtle tremors rippled, as if humanity itself stirred in its sleep, and the Titans, enraged, pulled harder at the abyss, their skeletal bodies rising higher, their towering forms now visible in full horror. But the historian lifted her torch and shouted, not her name, which she no longer remembered, but the forbidden word, Septu! And the flame exploded outward, a wave of pale fire that did not burn but erased, washing over the Titans, not destroying their forms but devouring their memory, stripping them of the dominion they had claimed, and they howled as their names vanished, their identities unraveling, their skeletal faces flickering as though they were being erased from history itself, and Aiden collapsed again, screaming, his body torn as the tether binding him to their cycle frayed, and the archaeologists shielded their eyes as the cavern was filled with light, and above, the inverted ships shattered into a rain of sparks, their geometry dissolving, their crystalline hulls exploding silently as though they had never been real, and the Titans clawed desperately at the abyss. But the more they struggled, the more the pale fire consumed them, unraveling their names, their forms, their entire existence from the fabric of memory. And in the historian's chest the torch burned hotter, devouring what little remained of her own humanity, binding her soul eternally to the flame. And though she felt herself dissolving, she also felt triumph, for with every spark that vanished she knew the world above was safe for one more cycle, perhaps forever. And yet even as the Titans fell back into nothingness, even as the cavern shook with their collapse, one voice among them lingered deeper, older, more powerful than the rest, whispering in the language of gods, a vow that pierced even the flames, the cycle does not end, flame-bearer. It only bends. We will return, in forms you cannot unmake, and the historian shuddered, knowing the war was not over, that what she had undone was only one thread of a tapestry too vast to comprehend, and as the cavern crumbled, as the archaeologists scrambled, as Aiden lay motionless upon the stone, his fate uncertain, the torch in her hand burned brighter, and she realized with sorrow that she could not leave with them, that she was now bound to the flame, bound to the shadow, a guardian like those she had seen in the corridor, condemned to remain half real, half forgotten, carrying the fire until the next time the cycle stirred. And as the cavern collapsed fully into darkness, she lifted the torch one last time, casting her flame over her companions, shielding them in a cocoon of concealment, carrying them through the cracks into the desert night, and when they awoke beneath the stars, coughing, weeping, alive, she was gone. Only a faint wisp of pale fire drifting into the wind, leaving them with nothing but questions, fractured memories, and the faint, terrifying sense that history was not as they had known it, that something vast had been hidden beneath the sands for thousands of years, and though they had survived, the words of the Titans lingered like poison. The cycle does not end, it only bends. And though the desert night stretched calm and endless above them, stars glittering like innocent eyes that had never seen the horrors beneath the sand, the survivors, dust-caked, bloodied, trembling, felt no comfort in the heavens, for the words of the Titans still echoed in marrow and soul, that the cycle does not end, it only bends, and they realized with an ache sharper than any wound that they had not witnessed a victory, but only a reprieve, and that reprieve had been bought not with triumph but with sacrifice. The historian, whose name none of them could now recall, as though it had been erased along with the Titans' memories, was gone, burned into pale fire, transformed into something that was no longer mortal, no longer theirs, and though she had saved them, they wept as though she had perished, because in truth she had, her humanity dissolved into duty eternal, and as the faint wisp of pale fire drifted into the wind, carried away toward the horizon, the archaeologists knew instinctively that they would never see her again, though her presence might linger as a whisper, as a flame glimpsed in shadowed corners, as a torch carried by unseen hands. In dreams, and silence pressed upon them, broken only by the ragged sobs of the young scholar who had stabbed the crystal floor, by the harsh breaths of the grizzled Egyptologist whose whispers had slipped him half into shadow, and by the rasping coughs of Aidan, whose body now lay limp yet trembling, veins flickering faintly between the last vestiges of golden godlight and the fragile pulse of human blood. And they gathered around him with hesitation, torn between fear and pity, for he had been the vessel of their near destruction, yet he had also been a boy, caught in the jaws of a destiny not of his making, and when one of them, the youngest woman, reached to touch his hand, his eyes snapped open, and for a moment the archaeologists recoiled, expecting the blaze of divine fury, but instead they saw only exhaustion, eyes sunken, haunted, still glowing faintly as though embers of something alien smoldered within. And his cracked lips formed words not of gods but of grief. She saved me. And tears streaked down his dust-caked cheeks, for though his memories of the historian's name had been erased, her act, her sacrifice, her fire lingered in him like an unquenchable truth, and the archaeologists exchanged glances, unsure whether to trust him, whether he remained man or something more, but before any choice could be made the ground beneath them trembled once more. Not with the fury of Titans rising but with the groan of earth closing its wounds, the cavern beneath, collapsing fully into silence, sealing itself as though it had never existed, swallowing its secrets once more beneath layers of shifting sand, and in the distance the pyramids rumbled, their perfect geometry fracturing subtly, tiny stones tumbling from ancient seams as though the monuments themselves exhaled relief or despair, and across the Nile Valley torches flickered in villages, dogs howled without cause. Farmers stirred uneasily from sleep, sensing in their bones that something vast had shifted, though they would never know what, for the cycle bent in silence, unseen by those it bound, and the survivors lay upon the desert floor beneath stars too bright, too cold, and tried to steady their breaths, their minds, their sanity, but silence offered no answers, only the crushing weight of uncertainty. For what had they truly accomplished, what had they truly witnessed, and what would become of them now, when they carried scars of knowledge that the world was never meant to hold? And as dawn's first light bled across the horizon, painting the sands in hues of blood and gold, the grizzled Egyptologist rose unsteadily to his feet, his shadow shimmering faintly as though he still lingered half in the second path, and he spoke with a hoarse voice cracked by both awe and terror. We cannot speak of this, not to the world above. They would not believe, and if they did, it would destroy them. But we must remember, even if memory costs us, Because the fire warned us, the cycle bends, it will rise again. And his words silenced the others, for though they wanted to scream, to flee, to bury the memory beneath layers of denial, they knew he was right, for silence could not unmake what they had seen, and knowledge, once touched, was a curse that clung forever. And as they turned their weary gazes toward Aiden, they saw that curse made flesh, for though his eyes were human, though his voice trembled with sorrow, though his body shook with weakness, the faint shimmer of godlight remained in his veins, and none could say whether he had truly been freed or whether he was still a vessel, bound to powers they could not comprehend. And Aiden himself seemed to know, his gaze shifting not to them but to the horizon where the wisp of pale fire had vanished, his whisper barely audible. "She gave everything, but I can still feel them, waiting." And the words chilled them deeper than any desert night, for they knew he spoke truth, that the Titans had not died but only been bent, stripped of memory yet not of essence, seeds of their return scattered somewhere in the fabric of existence, and humanity, ignorant, vulnerable, would not be ready when the cycle twisted again. And so they rose in silence, broken but alive, and began their long, staggering walk toward the faint glimmer of civilization. Each step heavy with both gratitude and dread, for they were now keepers of a secret older than civilization itself, and none could decide whether that burden was salvation or doom. And as the sun climbed higher, baking the sands, their shadows stretched long and distorted, and for an instant they seemed not human at all but elongated, skeletal, echoes of the very beings they had just defied, and each of them shuddered, realizing that the gods had not been fully erased, for their forms lingered in everything, even in the shadows of mortals. And though the archaeologists tried to push the thought aside, tried to cling to the fragile relief of survival, the seed of dread had been planted, and it would grow. And indeed, as days passed, as they staggered back into Cairo, disheveled, incoherent, barely able to explain the disappearance of half their team, they found themselves already fracturing, for memory gnawed at them, dreams haunted them, silence suffocated them, and though they had sworn never to speak, some found their tongues itching with fragments of truth. Others found their hands compelled to sketch forbidden glyphs in margins of journals, and others simply drank themselves into oblivion, unable to endure the weight. But no matter how they tried, they could not escape, for each night the stars above seemed to align differently, shimmering in patterns too deliberate to be random, as though the lattice itself lingered, faint but unbroken, whispering that the cycle bent but endured. And in the deepest hours of night Aiden would wake screaming, his veins glowing faintly, his voice echoing with both his own grief and tones not his own, and the archaeologists who still remained by his side would clutch him in terror and pity, torn between killing him and protecting him, for they no longer knew whether he was the last human link to salvation or the seed of doom itself. And Aiden, racked with guilt and despair, could only cling to the memory of the flame-bearer, the historian whose name he could no longer speak, whispering brokenly into the darkness, "I will not let them return. I swear it. Even if it kills me." And though his vow rang hollow against the enormity of gods, it was also the first spark of something the Titans had never understood, human defiance not rooted in servitude or fear, but in love, in grief, in memory that could never be fully erased, no matter how much fire consumed. And in that vow lay a possibility, fragile yet real, that when the cycle bent again, it might not bend the same way, for history, though it repeated, also remembered. And in the shadows of Egypt, where forgotten corridors stretched endlessly beneath sand and stone, faint whispers stirred, as if Anubis himself still watched, still guided, still waited, for the next mortal to choose the hidden door. And in the shadows of Egypt, where forgotten corridors stretched endlessly beneath sand and stone, faint whispers stirred, as if Anubis himself still watched, still guided, still waited, for the next mortal to choose the hidden door. And though the archaeologists tried to resume their lives in Cairo, blending again into a world of honking streets, dusty air, and tourists marveling at pyramids without knowing what slumbered beneath, They carried with them the invisible weight of forbidden truth. And every sound seemed sharper, every corner darker, every monument suddenly alive with an awareness they could not shake, for they had touched the cycle, bent it, and it had marked them in ways that could never be undone. And soon that mark began to show in subtle ways, first in their dreams where the corridors of pale fire returned night after night. Some awakening drenched in sweat after seeing the historian's burning silhouette reach for them with a torch, others waking with sand in their mouths though they had not left their beds, others still waking to the faint glow of glyphs scratched on walls they swore were blank before, and though they tried to convince themselves these were only nightmares, a symptom of trauma and exhaustion, they knew in their bones that the cycle was whispering back, pulling at their souls, testing the fractures in their silence. For silence is never whole, it always leaks, and the more they tried to suppress it, the more it demanded to be remembered. And one by one they began to slip, one scholar vanishing from her apartment in Giza without a trace, her journal left behind filled with pages of a single word, septu, written over and over until the ink tore the paper. Another found dead along the Nile with his body twisted, not by human violence but by something unseen, his shadow stretched unnaturally along the riverbank, pointing not west toward the desert but east toward the rising sun, as though dragged by an invisible hand, and still another driven into a kind of fever, muttering in half-forgotten tongues, until he clawed at his own skin to carve glyphs into flesh, whispering, "The fire bends, before collapsing into silence forever. And soon only 3 of the archaeologists remained, the grizzled Egyptologist with his shadow still shimmering faintly, the young scholar whose reckless plunge of crystal had wounded the cavern floor, and the woman who had once reached for Aiden's hand, and these 3 clung together not out of trust but out of desperation, for they could feel the net closing, they could feel the unseen forces pressing, testing, pulling them closer again to the abyss they had barely escaped, and at the center of their unease was always Aiden, who though alive, though human in so many ways, bore the golden flicker in his veins that marked him as both victim and vessel, a boy cursed by the gods' touch. And each night they would hear him muttering in his sleep, sometimes in his own broken voice, sometimes in the booming tones of something alien, and sometimes in whispers so faint and so many-layered it felt as though an entire chorus of forgotten souls were speaking through him, and they feared him, yet they pitied him, for he carried within him both the scar of humanity's near extinction and the faint ember of the historian's sacrifice, her flame still echoing in his blood, and Aiden himself grew weaker with each day, the godlight in him burning brighter in moments of stress or sorrow, threatening to consume him, but fading when he clung desperately to the memory of the nameless woman who had saved him, and he confessed to the others that he felt her still, not as a ghost but as a fire inside him, urging him towards something unseen, something hidden, and though they did not know whether to trust it, they had no choice, for the cycle did not rest, and indeed one night the choice was made for them. When the stars above Cairo shifted suddenly, aligning not as constellations of myth but as the exact geometry of the inverted ships they had seen in the cavern, blazing across the sky for only a moment before scattering again into randomness, and only those 4, Aiden and the 3 surviving archaeologists, saw it, their hearts seizing with dread as they realized the gods had not been unmade, they had not vanished, they were bending, waiting, reshaping, and the world above, oblivious, carried on with its markets, its politics, its wars and its loves, never knowing how close it stood to the return of forces that had once drowned it in cycles of shadow, and so the 4 survivors gathered in secrecy, meeting beneath Cairo's streets where tunnels carved by forgotten hands stretched beneath the modern city, and there, in the candlelight, they swore an oath, not to silence, for silence had already fractured, but to preparation, to searching, to finding the second path again. For if the cycle bent back they would not be unready this time, they would not face it blindly, and the grizzled Egyptologist revealed something he had never spoken until then, that when his shadow had flickered in the cavern, he had glimpsed not only the corridor of pale fire but another road, darker, deeper, where Anubis' jackal face lingered at the threshold, and though he had been dragged back before he could step into it, he had felt the pull, the knowledge, that there were more than two paths. More than one door, more than one secret buried in Egypt's sands, and his voice shook as he told them that perhaps the cycle itself was only a cage inside a larger labyrinth, and if they could find the hidden corridors, if they could navigate them, they might not only bend the cycle but break it, though at cost too great to imagine. And his words terrified the others, for if the pale fire demanded the erasure of self, what darker sacrifice might the deeper corridors demand? Yet Aiden, trembling, exhausted, burning with the faint glow of gods, whispered hoarsely, "Then we find it. We find all of it. Because she gave everything for us to live, and if we let them return, then her fire means nothing." And his words, though fragile, ignited in them the same terrible resolve, and so they began again the journey that had nearly destroyed them, not into pyramids this time but into the spaces between, the forgotten catacombs beneath Saqqara, the sealed tombs beneath Luxor, the hidden shafts of Giza that no modern map admitted existed, and at each place they felt the whisper of something ancient, a hum beneath the stone, a tremor in their bones, and sometimes they saw it, the flicker of pale fire in the corner of their eyes, the silhouette of the historian's form burning, guiding them forward, though each time they turned to follow it they found only emptiness, and they wondered if it was memory or manipulation, if the torch-bearer had become their guardian or if some darker echo wore her shape to lure them deeper. And as days bled into weeks, their search consumed them, pulling them further from the world above, further into obsession, until one evening in the desert, beneath the ruins of an unnamed pyramid long swallowed by sand, they unearthed something not meant for human hands, a chamber so small it seemed impossible it had survived, yet so perfect in its geometry that the moment they entered it they felt their minds unraveling. For every wall was carved not with hieroglyphs but with glyphs they had never seen, angular and fluid at once, symbols that twisted if stared at too long, burning themselves into vision, and in the center stood a single object, a black obelisk no taller than a man, its surface alive with faint pulses of blue light, as though breathing, and the moment Aiden stepped near it, his veins blazed brighter, his entire body convulsing as though the obelisk recognized him, and the others screamed, rushing forward, trying to pull him back, but the obelisk's light reached into him, wrapping him in a lattice of fire not pale but dark, flames that devoured light instead of giving it, and in that moment Aiden saw something the others could not, visions flooding him, corridors upon corridors, doors upon doors, a labyrinth stretching endlessly beyond the second path, a structure of shadow and fire that crisscrossed beneath the world like veins of a god, and at its center not Anubis, not Titans, but something older, something formless, something waiting, and the obelisk spoke, not in words but in pulses that reverberated through his blood, telling him that the cycle had bent because it was meant to bend, that the fire-bearer had not destroyed the gods but had only played her role in a greater weave, that every defiance, every rebellion, every sacrifice had already been foreseen, and that true escape, true freedom, lay not in bending or breaking the cycle but in stepping outside the labyrinth entirely, a place no god, no titan, no flame-bearer had ever reached. A place where memory itself dissolved, and when Aiden staggered back from the obelisk, gasping, his eyes wide with horror and awe, he told the others in a voice that was not only his, "We are not fighting gods. We are inside their dream. And if we do not wake, we will burn again and again, forever." And silence fell upon them, heavier than the desert itself, for they understood now that Egypt had not only hidden gods, not only hidden corridors, but hidden the truth of reality itself, a truth so vast it shattered the very meaning of victory or defeat, and though they trembled with fear, they also knew the path before them could no longer be turned aside, for the fire had chosen them, the labyrinth had claimed them, and the cycle, though bent, was already beginning to turn once more beneath their feet. And though the truth they had uncovered hung in the air like poison, searing their lungs with each breath, none of them dared to break the silence. For what Aidan had spoken was not merely revelation but undoing, a fracture in the foundation of everything they thought they understood about gods, myths, history, and even themselves. And as they stood inside that narrow chamber with its impossible geometry and the black obelisk pulsing like the beating heart of something immeasurable, their thoughts spiraled into dread, for if they were not fighting gods but instead trapped inside the dream of those very beings, then every step they had taken, every sacrifice, every whisper of rebellion had already been written into the dream's design, a script performed and reperformed countless times, and the possibility of freedom was nothing more than an illusion designed to keep them compliant, believing that defiance mattered when in truth it only deepened the dream's hold. And yet, even as terror chewed through their souls, the archaeologists could not deny the faint ember of hope that still smoldered in Aidan's voice, for the obelisk had not spoken of inevitability alone but of an outside, a beyond, a place where no god's geometry reached, no titan's fire burned, no cycle repeated, a place of waking, and though that possibility seemed as remote as a star glimpsed through a storm, it shimmered like salvation. Impossible to ignore, and so, trembling, consumed, half mad with grief and obsession, they turned their gazes toward the boy who had become their reluctant guide, and the grizzled Egyptologist, his voice ragged with the weight of decades spent chasing secrets he never fully grasped, asked the question that all of them feared. If this is a dream, then how do we wake? And Aidan's lips parted, but no human words came out, only a strangled gasp, for the answer was not knowledge but sensation, flooding through his veins from the obelisk, visions unraveling across his mind like scrolls written in lightning, cities made of shadow collapsing into sand, rivers of light flowing upward into the sky, faces of men and women across countless ages screaming in cycles of sacrifice, their names erased, their acts repeated, and above all a door that was not carved in stone or painted in fire but etched in absence, an opening formed not by presence but by what was missing. A void that called not with promise but with silence, and when at last Aidan forced words from his dry, cracked throat, they chilled the others deeper than the desert's coldest nights. To wake, something must be unmade. Not gods. Not the cycle. Us. And for a moment none of them could breathe, for the implication was too vast, too unbearable, and the young scholar who had once cracked the crystal floor shouted hoarsely in denial, spittle flying from his lips as he shook his head. No, no, we bled, we burned, we lost her, we've given everything already. You can't mean. But his voice broke, for he saw in Aidan's trembling eyes that the words were not invention but truth forced into his flesh by the obelisk itself, and the woman who had once reached for Aidan's hand felt her stomach twist, for she understood in that moment that the dream could only be broken by refusing to exist within it, by tearing the thread of self from the weave of eternity, by becoming absence itself. And she wanted to scream, to claw her way out of the chamber, to run until her legs gave out and her lungs burst, but her feet were frozen, her body locked by the enormity of the knowledge, and in that paralysis she heard again the whisper of the flame-bearer, the historian whose name they had all forgotten yet whose sacrifice still echoed, faint and fragile, inside their bones, and the whisper did not say, despair, but, choose, reminding them that even within a dream choice still mattered, for choice was the crack, the fracture, the seed of difference that the gods could not fully erase. And with that whisper trembling in her chest the woman raised her head and stared at Aidan, her voice soft yet steady. If we are inside the dream, then even our defiance is scripted. But if we unmake ourselves, if we vanish, then we slip where they cannot follow. Perhaps that is the second path she tried to show us. Not fire. Not judgment. Absence. And the words settled heavy into the chamber, sinking like stones into deep water, rippling against the pulsing of the obelisk, and for the first time since they had entered, its glow flickered, as if acknowledging her insight, or warning against it, and the grizzled Egyptologist, trembling, ran his hand across the alien glyphs on the wall, their edges biting his flesh, his fingers bleeding as he whispered half to himself, half to the gods. So all the monuments, all the tombs, all the prayers, not to preserve, not to honor, but to distract, to keep us dreaming, to keep us inside the labyrinth. Egypt was never about death or rebirth, it was about containment. And his words, bitter as bile, spilled like revelation, twisting centuries of human history into a crueler, darker truth. And as he fell silent, the chamber seemed to tighten, the walls pressing closer, the glyphs pulsing brighter, as if the dream itself recoiled from exposure. And in that suffocating moment Aiden dropped to his knees, clutching his chest, veins blazing gold and shadow all at once, his voice torn between scream and whisper as he choked out, "They're coming. They feel us. They know." And before the others could react, the obelisk's surface rippled like liquid, and from it erupted beams not of light but of absence, black rays that devoured the faint candle glow of their lanterns, plunging the chamber into darkness more suffocating than any night. And within that darkness they saw movement, not shapes but distortions, figures forming from the absence itself, elongated faces without features, bodies without edges. Beings not of fire or stone but of pure void. And the archaeologists screamed, for they realized these were not the gods they had faced in the cavern, not the titans, not the jackal-faced judge, but something deeper, something that existed behind the dream, the architects of the labyrinth itself, and their voices, when they spoke, were not heard with ears but carved directly into bone. "You should not have touched the door," they intoned in unison, each word pulling flesh tighter to skull, each syllable unraveling sanity like parchment burned to ash. And the archaeologists fell to the floor, clutching their heads, their mouths foaming, their eyes rolling back. And yet through the agony Aiden forced himself to rise, his body trembling with the combined fires of God and void, his voice hoarse yet defiant as he screamed into the black. "Then why show it to us? Why let us find it if we should not choose it?" And the beings of absence shifted, their forms flickering as if the question itself cracked them. And in that hesitation, faint but real, the flame-bearer's voice returned, her whisper cutting like a blade through the choking dark. "Because even architects forget. Even the dream has seams." And Aiden's eyes blazed with sudden clarity. His human will burning brighter than the alien fire, and he turned to the archaeologists, his voice breaking but resolute. "We can't run. We can't hide. But we can break through. Not all of us, but one." And his gaze lingered on each of them, on the grizzled Egyptologist with bloodied hands, on the young scholar shaking in terror, on the woman clutching her chest in grief. And they understood what he meant before he could say it, and horror gripped them, because choice was no longer abstract. It was immediate, it was sacrifice, it was the opening of the door not with glyphs or fire but with flesh, with soul, with absence. And as the void beings pressed closer there, shadows suffocating every breath, the archaeologists knew that Egypt's greatest secret was not buried in pyramids, nor written in scrolls, nor painted on tomb walls, but lived now inside them, a secret they had no choice but to embody, that to escape eternity's dream, someone must vanish into nothing, and though fear clawed at them, though despair strangled them, still the ember of defiance glowed. The whisper of the flame-bearer urging them on, for history could bend, and perhaps, if they dared enough, it could break. And though the chamber seemed to collapse beneath the weight of that truth, though the black obelisk's pulses now beat like a war drum within their skulls, though the void beings pressed closer with the inevitability of oceans swallowing shorelines, still the archaeologists clung to the ember of defiance, trembling yet unwilling to surrender. For in their hearts they understood that Egypt's greatest secret was not monuments of stone but the hidden choice of flesh. The possibility of becoming absence itself, and in that moment of realization silence stretched thick, broken only by Aiden's ragged breathing as his veins blazed alternately gold and shadow, a grotesque rhythm of god fire and void fire warring within him. and he looked at his companions, the grizzled Egyptologist, blood dripping from his torn fingertips as he pressed against the alien glyphs, the young scholar, his wide, terrified eyes darting like a trapped animal, lips muttering prayers in a dozen tongues, and the woman, her face streaked with tears yet burning with resolve, fingers still clenched around Aiden's arm as though anchoring him to humanity. And Aiden knew with brutal clarity that none of them could escape unchanged, that history had cornered them here in this forgotten chamber, demanding a price no one wished to pay, and yet, in that pressure, in that impossible demand, he also felt the faintest flicker of rebellion not scripted, not foreseen, for choice had returned to them, and it could not be undone, and so, lifting his trembling head, Aiden shouted hoarsely into the suffocating void. "If one must vanish, then let it be me!" But the void beings, their faceless forms undulating in ripples of absence, moved closer still, their bone-carving voices echoing, "The vessel is bound. The vessel is dream." And with that declaration the archaeologists gasped, for they understood. The fire of gods within Aiden tethered him, preventing him from escaping, forcing him to remain part of the cycle, to burn, to repeat, to suffer eternally. And their hope faltered, for if Aiden could not be the sacrifice, then one of them must. And the chamber quaked with that realization, dust sifting from unseen cracks above, the air thick with dread so heavy it seemed to drag their bones toward the ground, and the young scholar screamed, stumbling backward against the wall, shaking his head violently. "No! Not me! I won't! I can't!" His voice breaking as he clawed at the alien glyphs as if tearing them down could unmake the demand, but the glyphs pulsed brighter under his fingers, and his shadow elongated grotesquely, stretching across the floor until it detached from his body, writhing like a living thing, and with a final, choking gasp the scholar collapsed, his body convulsing as his shadow was dragged screaming into the black obelisk, leaving behind only a husk of flesh that crumbled to dust before their eyes. And the others screamed, horror ripping their throats raw, for they saw the sacrifice fulfilled, not chosen but stolen, the dream feeding itself, and yet in the aftermath, in the suffocating silence, they also saw something else. The black obelisk shuddered, its pulses faltering, the void beings stuttering in their advance as if the act had not gone as expected. As if the seam of the dream had widened further by the violence of that unwilling sacrifice, and Aiden fell to his knees, clutching his head, blood streaming from his nose as visions poured into him, visions of the labyrinth unraveling, of seams tearing open across Egypt, hidden doors flickering into existence in forgotten tombs, in buried catacombs, in places where humans would never dare tread, and in each seam pulsed the possibility of absence, of unmaking. And he realized with terror and awe that the dream was not a single cycle but countless cycles braided together, each sacrifice birthing a fracture, each fracture birthing a path. And the archaeologists were not the first to stand here, they were not the first to choose or be chosen, they were not the first to vanish, and yet their moment still mattered, for every seam widened the chance that one day, one moment, someone would finally wake. And when he lifted his bloodshot eyes to the grizzled Egyptologist and the woman, he whispered, "We're not alone. We've never been alone. Every sacrifice before us is still here, still burning, waiting for us to follow." And his words, though heavy with despair, also sparked a glimmer of terrible hope, for perhaps the historian, the flame-bearer, the forgotten thousands before her, were not gone but waiting at the edge of absence, torch-bearers lighting a road that no god could see, and the Egyptologist, his shoulders shaking beneath the weight of decades and revelations, pressed his bleeding hand flat against the wall, smearing red across the alien glyphs, his voice breaking as he muttered, "Then let me go. Let me be the next seam." And the woman cried out in protest, grabbing his arm, shaking her head violently. "No! You've carried this weight your whole life, but you don't have to carry it into death. We can find another way." But he only smiled, a broken, weary smile, his teeth blood-stained, his eyes glowing with a strange peace. "Another way may not come. Another seam must be carved. and I am old, my fire nearly spent. Better it be me than either of you. And before she could stop him, before Aiden could rise, the Egyptologist slammed his other hand against the black obelisk, pressing both palms to its pulsing surface, and instantly his body convulsed, his shadow writhing upward into the air, stretching until it split, fragmenting into 1,000 ribbons of darkness that were devoured by the obelisk's surface. And as his body burned with silent fire, he screamed not in agony but in defiance, his voice echoing like thunder across the chamber. Then remember us. Remember that we chose. And with that final cry his body shattered into shards of light and shadow, sucked screaming into the obelisk, leaving only a smear of ash upon the floor where he had stood, and the chambers shook violently, the obelisk's pulses spasming, the void beings reeling back with hissing shrieks like glass fracturing, and the woman fell to her knees, clutching her chest, sobbing uncontrollably, while Aiden staggered forward, his hands trembling as he reached toward the spot where the Egyptologist had stood, his voice hoarse with grief. He's not gone, he's part of it now, part of the seams. And as the chamber stabilized, the obelisk now cracked with glowing fractures spilling pale blue fire, the void beings whispered again, their voices sharper, more desperate. You cannot wake. You are thread. You are dream. You are bound. But Aiden, trembling, bloody, his body burning with unbearable energy, rose to his feet, his eyes blazing with both human sorrow and godfire defiance, and he shouted back with a voice that shook the chamber. Then I will burn your dream to ash, seam by seam, until the waking comes. And the void beings recoiled, their faceless forms stuttering like broken shadows, their chorus fracturing, and in that moment, though the dream still bound them, though the cycle still turned, though absence still demanded its price, the archaeologists who remained knew that Egypt's greatest secret had never been the gods, nor the monuments, nor the labyrinth, but the truth that even within eternity, even within a prison of fire and shadow, the smallest act of defiance could still tear a seam in the dream, and through those seams, someday, someone would wake. And though the archaeologists felt the weight of eternity pressing down on their fragile human frames, though grief gnawed at their hearts from the loss of the Egyptologist who had torn himself into absence, though the chamber itself pulsed with the fractured heartbeat of the dream, Aiden's words did not vanish like echoes swallowed by silence but instead clung to the air like fire refusing to die. And in that moment the woman, her cheeks streaked with tears, her body trembling with exhaustion, lifted her head and saw something the others had not. Saw that the cracks spreading across the black obelisk were not merely fractures of stone or light, but glimpses, thin glimpses into a beyond where the geometry of the dream did not hold sway, where faint stars burned in strange constellations unrecognized by human memory. And for a heartbeat she believed, she truly believed, that beyond those cracks was the waking, and her breath caught like a child seeing dawn after endless night, yet just as quickly dread swept back over her. Because the void beings had not retreated fully but lingered, their faceless shadows seething and twitching, their whispers growing louder, more venomous, carving directly into marrow. Thread cannot cut thread. Fire cannot burn fire. Dream cannot wake dream. And those words sank sharp into her chest, twisting her faint hope into suffocating doubt. But Aiden, staggering yet unbroken, shouted back with cracked lips and blood-soaked throat. You are wrong. Because even in dreams there are seams, and seams are not bound. They break, they bleed, they open. And as if to answer him the obelisk shuddered again, its fractures widening, its pale blue fire hissing like steam escaping from the heart of the earth. And visions poured into Aiden's head, visions so vast and overwhelming he nearly collapsed, visions of deserts stretching not across sand but across timelines, each pyramid not a tomb but an anchor pinning human consciousness into the labyrinth. Each hieroglyph not a prayer but a lock, each ritual not worship but maintenance. And he saw how for thousands of years mortals had been unknowingly repairing the prison, painting the walls of their own cage, repeating the cycle without question. But he also saw the countercurrent, faint but real, the seams carved by defiance, the screams of those who refused, who sacrificed not for gods but against them. And through those seams he saw flickers of faces, not just the Egyptologist who had given himself moments ago, not just the historian flame-bearer who had whispered from the corridor of Anubis, but countless others, farmers who vanished without graves, priests who destroyed forbidden scrolls, slaves who ran into the desert and never returned, all of them forgotten by history but alive in absence, their whispers building, their defiance layering into a road that glowed faintly beneath the cracks of the obelisk. And Aiden realized with horror and awe that they were not alone at all. They were standing on the shoulders of an army of the erased, and for the first time in millennia the seam was wide enough for the road to show itself, faint but undeniable, a road not of fire or stone but of shadows, leading into the nothingness beyond the dream. And when he staggered toward it, the void beings screamed with voices that split the stone around them, their forms thrashing like torn veils, their whispers now shrieks. Close it. Close it. Threads must remain. Dream must hold. And they surged forward, their faceless voids collapsing into a storm of absence that blotted out the chamber's faint light. But before they could consume him, the woman, whose grief had become steel, stepped in front of Aiden, her voice raw and trembling but steady with human resolve as she shouted, "No! You won't have him. You won't take him." And she threw herself against the black storm, her body shaking violently as the void tore at her flesh, burning her skin from bone, ripping screams from her throat, but in her eyes there was no fear, only fire, only defiance, and as she was devoured she laughed, the sound cracked but real. "Even in your dream, we choose!" And with her laughter her body shattered, not into dust nor light but into 1,000 fragments of memory, childhood laughter, desert winds, the warmth of a mother's hand, all scattering into the storm like sparks, burning holes in the void. And Aiden screamed, his voice breaking, for though her sacrifice tore him apart inside, it also widened the seam further, the cracks now spilling rivers of pale blue light that cascaded across the chamber, tearing into the geometry of the dream, unraveling the patterns that had bound them. And the void beings shrieked louder, their forms melting like wax under a sun they could not withstand. And Aiden, falling to his knees, realized the truth. This was not the end, not yet, but the road had been carved wider, the seams now bleeding openly, the dream unraveling faster than before, and though the cost had been unbearable, though 2 more lives had been burned into absence, they had reached closer to the waking than any before them. And his tears streaked down his dirt-stained face as he whispered to the ashes around him, "You are not gone. You are the road. You are the flame. I will carry you." And the chamber groaned like a dying beast, its walls buckling, its glyphs shattering, the obelisk splitting down its center with a sound like thunder tearing across eternity. And through that split Aiden saw it, the door of absence, no longer a faint suggestion but a yawning chasm, blacker than void yet shimmering with promise, the way beyond the dream. And though his body trembled with exhaustion, though his soul was torn between fire and shadow, he staggered toward it, each step dragging his blood across the cracked floor, each breath a battle, until he stood before the impossible opening, his reflection stretched across its surface like a ghost, and for the first time he saw himself not as vessel, not as god, not as dream, but as human, fragile and broken yet burning brighter than eternity. And behind him the void beings writhed in fury, their faceless mouths opening in silent screams, their chorus fracturing as they realized what had been done. And one of them lunged, its shadow arm slicing through the air toward him. But Aiden did not flinch, did not step back, for he heard the whisper of the flame-bearer again, the same words that had carried him this far. "There is always a hidden door, but it must be chosen." And with a trembling hand, with the weight of thousands of years pressing down on him, with the screams of gods and the cries of mortals in his ears, Aiden stepped forward into the absence, into the waking, into the place beyond the dream. And as his body vanished through the seam, the chamber collapsed behind him, the obelisk shattering into fragments that dissolved like ash in a storm, the void beings shrieking as they unraveled into nothing. And Egypt's greatest secret, hidden for thousands of years, finally revealed itself not in monuments or myths, not in gods or rituals, but in the defiance of fragile humans who dared to carve seams into eternity, who dared to believe that even dreams could be broken, and though the desert would one day bury the ruins again, though the world would forget the names of those who stood in that chamber, the seam would remain, waiting, whispering, promising that someday, somewhere, humanity would wake. And yet as Aiden stepped into the absence, into the place that was supposed to be beyond the dream, he did not feel the relief of waking, nor the comfort of freedom, nor even the silence of death, but instead a disorienting shift, as if the ground of reality itself was being peeled away beneath him, as if he were falling not through space but through the layers of something far older, far vaster. And he realized with a shudder that the absence was not empty at all, but alive in a way that the desert, sands, the pyramids, the labyrinth, and even the void beings had never been, for here the silence was not stillness but breathing, and the blackness was not void but watching, countless unseen eyes flickering in and out of existence across horizons that bent and broke, and Aiden's fragile human mind screamed at the enormity of it, but his body, still burning faintly with the fire of gods and the residue of sacrifice, forced him forward, staggering along a path that did not look like a path at all but felt like one under his feet, a road carved from the memories of those who had gone before him, the defiant dead, their whispers brushing his ears like ghostly winds, saying his name, urging him onward, telling him he was not alone. And with every step he saw them more clearly, not just shadows but flickers of faces, whole armies of the forgotten stretching beside him, some in ancient Egyptian robes, some in chains, some in simple rags, some dressed in garments of ages he did not recognize, all walking with him though none truly touched him, their figures dissolving and reforming like smoke, but all of them burning with the same fire, the fire of refusal, the fire of choice, and he understood now that he was walking the same road carved seam by seam for thousands of years, a road that did not lead to waking directly but to something even stranger, the boundary where the dream could be seen for what it was, where the prison could be touched from outside, where one might finally decide whether to break it or to repair it, and as he walked the whispers grew louder, swelling into a chorus that nearly drowned out his thoughts, some urging him to keep going, others begging him to turn back, others warning him that beyond the boundary lay not waking but something worse, something more permanent than any cycle, something the gods themselves feared. And Aiden's legs shook with every step as he wondered if he was walking towards salvation or into the jaws of a trap that had lured countless others before him. But the road did not pause for his doubt, it pulled him forward, and after what felt like both moments and centuries he reached a place where the blackness cracked open, not like the seam of the obelisk but like the tearing of a sky, a vast wound in the fabric of the absence itself. And through it he saw not the waking world but a vision so impossible it froze him in place. He saw Earth, not as it was but as it had been, endless deserts glowing under alien constellations, oceans boiling under strange moons, pyramids standing not as tombs but as beacons of fire reaching into the heavens, and above it all colossal shapes moved, shapes too vast to be gods, shapes whose mere outlines sent tremors through his bones. And he understood with sickening clarity that the dream had not been made by gods at all, but by something older. Something that had woven itself into the marrow of the universe before humans had ever walked upright, something that fed not on worship or sacrifice alone but on continuity itself, on the endless repeating cycles of thought, memory, and death, and that Egypt, with all its rituals and monuments, had only been one thread in a tapestry that stretched across worlds, across civilizations forgotten not by accident but by design, their histories erased because remembering them would weaken the weave. And suddenly Aiden realized the true meaning of the Void Being's whispers. Thread cannot cut thread. Fire cannot burn fire. Dream cannot wake dream. They were not lies but warnings, because even defiance, even sacrifice, even seams, were still part of the dream's design, controlled failures built into the labyrinth to maintain the cycle, and his heart froze as he wondered if even his own rebellion, his own pain, his own steps had been anticipated, written into the pattern long before he was born, and despair nearly crushed him to his knees. But then, faint as a flicker of candlelight, he remembered the Egyptologist's final words, then. "Remember us! Remember that we chose!" And he realized that choice itself, even if anticipated, even if accounted for, still mattered, because choice was not about breaking the dream in one strike, but about carving seams that widened over time, seams that multiplied, seams that one day might finally collapse the design altogether. And with trembling lips he whispered into the vast wound before him, "I choose to keep going." And the absence around him trembled, the road beneath him shifting like a living serpent, carrying him closer to the wound until he felt its heat on his face, not the heat of fire but of memory, the heat of every moment ever lived. And as he touched the edge with his bleeding hand he was hurled forward, through the wound, into a place beyond even absence. A place that was not dream and not waking but something else, something raw and unfinished, a place of beginnings, and in that place he saw them. The architects of the labyrinth, not as shadows, not as faceless beings, but as vast luminous figures whose bodies stretched across constellations, their eyes burning like collapsing stars, their voices echoing like the collapse of time, and one of them spoke directly into him, bypassing his ears, bypassing his mind, vibrating in his blood. "You are thread. You are fire. You are not meant to stand here." And Aiden, though every nerve in his body screamed with fear, though his heart pounded like a trapped animal, lifted his chin and whispered hoarsely, "Maybe not. But I'm here anyway." And the figure seemed to shudder, its form rippling, and for the first time in its eternal existence something like hesitation crossed its vast, star-born face, as if the tiniest human defiance had created a crack in something that had never cracked before, and in that hesitation Aiden felt the army of the forgotten surge behind him, their whispers no longer scattered but united. A chorus of countless voices screaming together, not in fear but in demand. "Wake! Wake! Wake!" And the sound shook the architects, their luminous forms flickering like torches in a storm. And though Aiden knew he was still only one thread in an endless weave, he felt the power of all those erased lives rising with him, and he knew that this was not the end of the story but the beginning of something far more dangerous, far more